Hello and welcome back to MLQ Replay. I'm Ethan Sturm alongside Nick Jablonski and Jack McGovern. Week 9 of the MLQ season is in the book. We have only one more regular season weekend, North Division Championships left. We are less than 20 days away from MLQ Championship. I really don't know where this season's gone or where this summer's gone, but we had a fun weekend this weekend. We had 2 series, lots to talk about, so we're not going to hesitate too much. But let's kind of talk about it all, and let's kind of start big picture wise with where we're at. And Nick, I kind of want to talk to you something we haven't talked about maybe as much when we're talking about strategy and big picture macro things. The tempo of the game right now. I'm really interested because you watch some of these teams. You're watching like the way this Washington team's playing and this way like this New York team's playing, and they're playing so up tempo. And other teams in the league, aren't, necessarily playing that speed. You see a team like New Orleans. Do you think these are just strategic changes through like in the league? Do you think this is responses to the rule changes? Kind of what do you think about the current tempo of quad ball in MLQ?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still on the slower side across the board. I think there's very few teams that can play on the faster side of things, but it's definitely part of the rules change has definitely accelerated it because you can take more risks. Because if you speed a team up that's not used to playing fast, they no longer have that resource of taking the reset. But I think that also good coaches recognize that when teams get sped up, teams make mistakes. And so by training their team to play faster than any of the other teams, you're going to force mistakes out of these other teams. We saw it this weekend, right? I mean, game 1, Washington played so fast at the end of the game and forced a turnover on 2 of the last 3 goals, I believe.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, it has to be program built too to be able to play at that tempo, because you have to be able to play through your 21 if you're going to play at that tempo for an entire game. And credit to some of these programs, they are playing through the 21. They're trusting everyone. They're not only trusting their stars, and I think that's definitely playing a part. Jack, what are you kind of seeing when it comes to kind of pace of play and tempo in the sport right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Depth is really important, and so is chemistry built over a number of years. I think it's in part a response to the changes in the rules, the addition of the no resets rule, but we've seen it for a couple seasons now. I mean, New York was doing it last year. Other teams have been pushing the pace for a couple years. San Antonio, notably, I think has been a real pioneer in kind of counter pressing and just looking to play on the break as much as possible. I feel like it's a response to like the success of tightly organized zone defenses in quad ball. If you can catch a team, disorganized, before they get into their zones around the hoops, that's maybe your best chance to score. And I think teams have realized that over the past couple of years.
For sure. So let's jump into our 2 series from the weekend. And we're going to start down in the South Division with our series between the League City Legends and the San Antonio Soldados. A series that, from a standings vantage point, did not have any stakes, but far from having any stakes. This was a series about pride. This is 2 programs who basically are one big rivalry, both on the MLQ level and on the college level. And, I think it kind of showed in the way, everything played out. This was not a San Antonio team that was, trying to get everybody minutes and trying to prep for MLQ championships. This is a San Antonio team looking to win. And this was a League City team who was going to give them everything they had to kind of stop that. And the games, were very competitive for a lot of the way. Jumping out in game 1, I mean, it was 50-50 at, I think, 15 minutes before San Antonio went on a little run to jump out ahead. And League City, to its credit, got back in the game again before San Antonio could put it away. Game 2, a little less close, 185-80. In the last one, 170-125. But, this is a team, a Soldados team that, has never failed to make the semifinals, that has a proud history. And it's a League City team that's, had its up and down. So, it's a statement for the Legends, even just to kind of be hanging in these games, playing this team tight. Jack, let's start on the Legends side, because this will be, the end of their season. What were you liking from what you were seeing from them this weekend as they kind of grown into their season?
Yeah, I think League City has really developed a multi-dimensional offense. I think for so many years, it was kind of a drive and kick offense, very direct, very intentional. But now I think we see League City attacking from multiple different angles, and they have the personnel. They have MLQ rookie Great Usiafre, who's top 10 in scoring and showed out again this weekend. Hayden Boys should be a household name around the league, tied for second in scoring right now. Just an excellent player, but they have a number of different weapons, and it's the angles that they're attacking the hoops. That they're coming from the sides, they're coming from behind, and it's just been really cool to watch how League City chooses to attack the opposing defenses. I think was the key to them kind of hanging with San Antonio when they did.
Yeah, and I think to some degree you could argue that the crisper, or at least the more incisive passing, was coming from the League City side. I think San Antonio was getting a lot of their buckets in transition. They were getting a lot of their buckets from Jay Stewart being Jay Stewart. But if you were looking for a team that was going to try to break the defense down with three passes that were all within the scope of the hoops and were actually trying to move the defense around, I think we were getting more of that from League City. Of course, I think the thing that's plagued League City at times this season, and I think their beaters have put up some good fights and some good series, but in a series like this with a beater like Chris De La Fuente in the series, it just kind of felt like that was just kind of the one step too far, and the thing that when San Antonio just needed to settle down, get back control of the game, create those transition opportunities for their chasers to kind of run rampant on, they could just put De La Fuente back in the game. 11 plus minus on the series in just 30 possessions. Had 1.73 dodgeballs when they were on the field. Was imposing their will. And at other times, I think, the League City beaters were at least able to, exchange some. But what were you kind of seeing in the beginning game, Jack?
Yeah, I thought the Legends beaters did a solid job at attacking some of the weaker points in the San Antonio beater core. I think they created some windows when they could, but I just think they have to know when they're facing a beater who's as hot as Chris De La Fuente right now, and they have to protect themselves a little bit more, hold back a bit, and just look to kind of conserve those dodgeballs and not leave themselves so exposed at times. I'm a big fan of the one-on-one skills that this beater core has. Their aggressiveness, their athleticism. I've said that before, but yeah, I think they're just going to look to improve and gain some more experience in coming years to try to make better decisions when they're playing a really hot opposing beater.
Yeah, and I think as this team kind of develops and grows, obviously we talked about this is a very young team. A lot of these players are still playing for the Sam Houston State program as they have been in recent years, and I think we just need a couple more pieces that are just going to provide a little bit more consistency on offense in terms of putting the ball through the hoop. And we've talked about cheat codes. I don't think League City necessarily needs cheat codes. I mean, I think Hayden Boys can be one, and the way that great plays behind the hoops can be one as well. But just a few more players that can kind of step up. I kind of liked what I saw from Juan Acevedo. This is the only series he played for the team. This was laying hits, was flying all over the field. Also had one catch and almost had two. Almost had the catch in game one as well. It's clear the players are, on the edges of this program. It's clear the Sam Houston State team knows how to recruit and then knows how to turn those players into future legends that, can make a difference. It's clear this coaching staff's doing a good job developing those players to their potential. I think this team is growing a lot. I think just, a lot of the other teams in that division have been as well. Jumping over the other side of the ball, we've talked a lot about the San Antonio beater core. And I think you can kind of track its highs and its lows, right? You can say that even with their beater core and how much we've been down on it, they hung with Austin for a couple games, right? But, also, they were held down by New Orleans because they had strong beaters. So, Jack, now that we have a 12-game sample size of this, San Antonio beater core, what do you think it means for this team kind of entering championships?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it because, I know they have some solid players and good chemistry. But I think of the top tier teams, of the teams that have finished in the top two, the championship contenders, so New York, Austin, Chicago. I think San Antonio is by far the weakest beating core. I think they don't have the depth that the other teams have. And I want them to go prove me wrong. I really do in those matches at championships, but I think they're going to struggle when facing those third and fourth lines from a New York program, a Chicago program. And so, they have a couple options. They could just ride, their top lines, for heavy minutes. Maybe that's what they turn to. But they're not going to have the fresh legs that their rivals for the BNP Cup will.
Nick, obviously this weekend we saw two teams who are going to be second place teams getting direct paths to quarterfinals with real potential roads to make semifinals for sure. And both those teams have elite quadball games and, some question marks in the dodgeball game. How would you kind of compare and contrast them? And then on the San Antonio side specifically, do you think the strength of that quadball game can be enough?
I mean, I think this really comes down to who does Chicago pick across the board if we're talking about between the two of them. I think that Chicago's beating core has the potential to overwhelm either of these two beating cores, Washington's or San Antonio's, in which case it's going to be for a very, very long series. But whichever one of them ends up facing Toronto, I think can definitely put up a fight across the board. I do think that Toronto's beating core is arguably maybe a little bit deeper than San Antonio's and probably equivalent to Washington's across the board. But I think that both teams, when it comes to the playoffs, right, that Saturday they have to play 3 games maximum at that point. I think that either of these teams are going to empty the bag and play their top lines as aggressively as possible if they have to get through to the semifinals at this point. I think that's what you have to do, right? It's playoff basketball all over again, right? You cut your lines, you play shallower groups, you play longer minutes, you do what you have to do to win. And both of these teams have enough depth to do what they have to do to win.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I kind of want to ask you a really specific strategic thing, Nick. League City was throwing both some hoop zone as well as some 2-2s at San Antonio. And in both cases, a spot that Jay Stewart really seemed to be looking to find himself a lot of the time was right in the well, which, not necessarily the most common place I think a lot of people would think to tell their attacking players to get to. So just from a strategic aspect, what do you think he's looking to gain by going to those positions?
Yeah, I think, first of all, Ethan, for our viewers, would you mind defining the well?
Sure. The well would be the area, even with the hoops, where you can't actually see any hoops, so you can't take a shot. So it'd be on either side, exactly even on the hoops.
Yeah. So the biggest thing that, at least in a lot of the systems that you and I play in, that we find with the well, is that's where you have to win on one-on-one, right? If you win a one-on-one, the whole zone has to shift to you in some fashion, and that's when the attacking players on either side, either the back of the hoops or the top of the hoops, can find their option, or even on the other side of the hoops, realistically, at some point. But I mean, Jay Stewart is a one-on-one phenom, right? There's very few players in this league who can stop Jay Stewart one-on-one. So if Jay can win those one-on-ones on the side, then the rest of the defense has to collapse to him, and that opens up his other teammates to make easy scoring opportunities. And so I think that's something that a lot of teams, I think we still see across the league. We see some of the players who are most comfortable taking those one-on-one matchups, attacking from the top of zones. And that's where the zones are decided to defend against, right? That's what they do when they square away. So I think that by moving players either behind or to the side there where they're given a little more chance to work in space, you end up creating opportunities for other players all the time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing worth mentioning is that it's kind of an uncomfy place for beaters to deal with, a player coming right down that line, because there's so many hoops and quadball players and whatnot in the way. The throws are very rarely clear. It's just that you really have to be a specific talent to be able to actually attack from that space, because you have to be able to make the mid-range shot a little bit when you come around the corner. You have to maybe have a jump shot. You have to be able to win one-on-ones where you can't really go all that wide. And obviously Stewart can kind of produce in those situations. It'll be interesting to see if it's a look they keep going to as we move on to MLQ Championship. Jack, the last question I want to ask you about the series, and we're going to jump to our interview. Talking about the San Antonio team and kind of keeping with our, theme of tempo. I don't think the South has necessarily played at the highest tempo amongst the divisions so far this season. Obviously, we've seen what New Orleans did. And, I think watching the two series from this weekend, felt like they were played at two very different tempos. I'm not too worried about the quadball players of San Antonio, and maybe you are, but, obviously when beater play is going 100% instead of, just being beater play is only happening in the half court and then the next half court and the next half court, it's two kind of entirely different animals. So how do you think the San Antonio team will, kind of handle that change as they start running into, the Chicagos, the New Yorks, etc.?
Yeah, I would agree with your assessment. I think I'm not very worried about the San Antonio Chasers. I think their defensive physicality has really improved from last year. This is now a team that hits really hard. Last year, heading into champs, I think I had a lot of concerns about the Soldados and whether they would be able to hold up defensively. Not as worried this year. This team has shown they can hit. And I think they're very comfortable, flying out on the fast break. I think they've played at the fastest pace maybe of any team in the South. So yeah, not worried about their Chasers, but I do think the beating game of the Washington-Boston series was just so much quicker than the beating game of the San Antonio League City series. So I think that's going to be a significant adjustment, and it'll depend on who the North Division champion ultimately chooses, whether San Antonio gets kind of to ease into it by playing a Toronto team that I don't think plays super fast, or whether they're going to start against a Chicago team that is really going to try to blitz them. So I think that'll be quite a tricky adjustment for them to make.
Yeah, and we'll save that conversation for the end of the show after we've also talked about Washington, because I am curious to hear your guys' opinions on that. But let's jump into our interview. Joining us tonight, the head coach of the League City Legends and chaser for the team, Ashton Jean-Lewis. Ashton, thanks so much for coming on tonight.
I also like to start the interview by saying happy birthday to JJ. Today's his birthday. He turned, I'm assuming 21, because it seems like he's forever youthful. Also, can we get Jay Stewart some more shorts? They're completely torn from all the people who have been trying to tackle him all season, and literally the shorts is the only thing they've been able to grab, and so they're literally ripped in half. Just saying. That's all I got. What's up, guys?
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. First thing I kind of want to talk to you about is, kind of outlook and, as you're kind of closing up the season, kind of, general feelings, because obviously we were kind of talking this in the pre-show, right? It's the soft victories only matter for so long. And we're all talking up that we all think this League City team is going places and improving, but, it's when it comes down to the actual results, it's the really, really tough losses to New Orleans where every game was neck and neck. It's the Kansas City series where you go up 1-0 and can't get it done in the next two. So how do you kind of balance that? Hey, we are still growing as a team. This is a better team than we were last year but we're still haven't quite gotten there.
Yeah, man. So first off, shout out to everybody of the South Division who made it to MLQ championships. Really hard earned, really hard fought. I talk to players on other teams on a pretty regular basis. In particular, I talk to Charlton Trammell, and we joke about it all the time. Where like if you're going to be a player in the South, you got to know how to play probably at least 3 or 4 different types of defense, and then you have to know what the adjustment is to be able to beat all 3 or 4 types of those defenses for you to be able to get on the field. And that's coming from for as much as people talk about the numbers in New Orleans, at this point, they were the people who were like put into the corner. They were the ones who didn't have like a ton of resources. They didn't have a ton of players. And now these years later, all those players, they've been playing the entirety of 100% of MLQ level games, USQ level games combined together. And now they've become they've become the hunters instead of the hunted in the South, and mad respect to them in those really close games. And we were going in the flag on pitch, and we knew what time it was because we know that TJ is a world-class seeker, and it went his way almost every single time. And then of course you watch the beater game, and Josh Mansfield really did what at this point expect Josh Mansfield to do anytime you give him. Actually, he doesn't even need a ball to do most of the stuff that he does. So, but yeah, him and Alex Pucciarelli and Sarah Yofnovsky and everybody, they've been together for so long and they've gotten so good. It's amazing to see what KC has done. Not just, a team that could very easily just only rely on Senna Morimoto to go out there and make plays happen. And Senna, for him to, take the role back from being the scorer that we all know that he can be to being a distributor and seeing Usami kind of take that next step. And I can't wait to see what Robbie Wallace becomes when it's all said and done. And of course, you see players like KJ out there doing their thing all the time. So the South Division is real tough as a whole, no matter how you slice it. And then, of course, San Antonio has most of the roster from the reigning national college champs. That's not by accident. A lot of those players worked really hard. They're really talented. And then Austin is a super team of every single player that probably is the living nightmare of every player in this league, right? All on one team, all together for an entire summer. So, but it's been pretty dope being the coach. I spent a lot of time watching film, and a lot of the time I spend watching film is of course like self-assessment, and then of course assessing the opponent. And it's just really tough watching back and looking at how close, we're talking like 3 or 4 possessions. You mentioned it when you were talking about game 1 versus San Antonio, how at the 15-minute mark it was tied up, and we literally broke into the huddle, and the first thing out of everybody's mouth was about, we had 4 possessions at the 15. I didn't even have to say it, which was the amazing part, which is a sign of development and growth, right? There was 4 possessions after that 15-minute mark where we did not score at all, and San Antonio was able to turn those into transition points, and that's how they ran away with it. I believe becoming a better player first starts with the mind, and then it matriculates to your body, but they understood what was going on, and it's really nice to be in a huddle where you're talking with players who are smart enough to know what they're doing wrong and make the adjustments. Saw a lot of development from a lot of people. Like to talk about great, and of course, great is amazing. But Gabby Lopez, I don't hear many people writing about her just in general, because Gabby is a full-on rookie, and she started 3 series for us this season and was a huge help as to why we were able to win a lot of the games that we won this season, and why a lot of those games were close. And when we switched to mixing it up with double male beater, and this is the important part about being a good player, she felt like she should be on the field going out there and making plays, and she let me know every single time. And that's the kind of players that I'm proud to say play for the League City Legends. So, yeah, it's been pretty wild.
For sure. And, Gabby had the second best, I believe the best plus minus on the team in this series.
Don't say that so loud. She's going to get mad at me. Don't do it.
But so kind of talk us through, because Nick and I are both ultimately college coaches in our hearts. And, there's nothing more exciting than kind of getting one of those high potential players just come walking through your door. And in a way, you kind of got that this year. Yes, they were rookies in college first, but Great was barely a rookie in college. They played 2 tournaments before they showed up on your doorstep. So kind of talk to me about working with some of these young players and kind of the rewards and how it's been for you over the course of this summer.
I tried to take the approach that was utilized on me when I first joined the Legends. For the people who are watching at home who think very highly of me for some reason, I have no idea why. I didn't make the first 2 League City Legends teams that I tried out for. I was a practice squad player, and it was because I was competing against borderline Team USA. And I say borderline, one of them was a Team USA male chaser and Cody Marshall, and then guys like Jake Freeman and Dylan Freeman, Hank Doogie. And at one point, the first season I did make the Legends, it was with Hayden, JJ, Chris, and a lot of other players who would go on to do amazing things, right? So I had to fight my way up from the bottom and had to develop my own style. We had a set offense. We had a set style of offense. We had different approaches. And a lot of what we had to do with some of the younger players that were coming in was help them understand that there's like 1,000,000,001 different ways to score. At the end of the day, it's about putting the ball through the little circle thing more than the opponent. And that comes with knowing when to attack and when not to attack. And if you look at and since we're talking about great, you look at where Great started when we played against Austin, from breaking like 3 tackles to score goals to where he was at San Antonio, which I think he only had like 1 or 2 turnovers in comparison to the double-digit turnovers he had in the first 2 series of the season. And he was just on fire versus San Antonio. He was in perfect spots. And of course, the beating game didn't necessarily go our way 100% of the time. Nobody's expecting anybody to ever be perfect 100% of the time on the field. But Great made some ridiculous reads that we had not seen him make at the beginning of the summer, and it's because he's been dedicating the time and the effort to getting smarter as a player. And of course, he's been hanging around guys like Hayden and Chris Dorsey and Brandon Cabana and Mallory Hughes and Sarah Stewart, who is probably the deadliest scorer on our team, to be honest with you. And if you say that to any legend, they probably will agree with you. But he hangs around those kind of players all the time, and he learns a lot from how they are able to get the ball, how they're able to score, where they're at when they're scoring, and how to attack. And like I said before, the best part about guys like Great and players like Great in general, and this started happening as the season would go on, when mistakes would happen in practice, I, at the beginning of the summer, would have to point out why we don't do that. And as time went on, they're telling me what they messed up on before I even open my mouth, because they know that I'm going to say something. And they know, they're like, oh yeah, I know I wasn't deep enough. Oh yeah, I know I was too close on this side right here. And it's amazing, because that's the development of a player as a whole, right? And then of course, as time went on, they fixed it. And that's the most important part of it all. But it's been a lot of fun to watch players like learn the game, and it's also put a lot of onus on me personally to make sure that I'm teaching them how to play the right way. You know what I mean? Like, you can't. I don't want them to be dummies like me when they're out there on the field. I want them to be smarter and better than me, and all that kind of stuff like that. And luckily for them, they got a lot of real natural talent, and we just kind of steer it in the right direction. You know what I mean?
For sure. So a lot of what's going to be being talked about when it comes to analyzing for this MLQ championship is like, can certain teams kind of overcome, and might have heard us just talking about this, shortcomings in a specific beater matchup. And, not selling your beater short at all, but, some of the teams in your division are just chock full of Team USA beaters. It is what it is. So as a coach, how do you kind of approach some of those games where maybe that overall, maybe there's a slight deficit in the beater game, but how are we going to attack this? How are we going to stay tight despite that?
So if people do or don't know, I watch like way too much film. Like, every opponent that we played against, I watched, and this is why I hate having a schedule where you have more than one opponent that before they play you, they haven't played a single series at all, right? So we played against Austin. That's one thing to start off with. I'm kind of familiar with a lot of the club players. Luckily, their team is 99% club players, and I've played against all those guys. So I know how they're going to play. I know what their style of approach is going to be. And then we also have film of how they played during the USQ season, and we kind of like retrofitted those approaches in our film breakdown of like, look out for these things. If you see this kind of angle, if you see somebody approaching this way, this is what they're setting up for. You should be looking behind you at all times, because they got players like Mel Kite, who not only is really good at disappearing, but she's also really good at ripping shots, right? But I think a lot of it was centered around 2 things. In practice, we had a scout team defense that was comprised of players on our team, right? So I would watch every single game that our opponent had played up until that point of the season to find the trends, to figure out what the rotations on their defense are normally, and then talk about where the gaps are in those defenses. So for instance, you know what? I'm not going to do that to San Antonio. I'm sure plenty of people could figure it out, but the way that they play compressed 2-2 zone, there's one aspect of it that we, as the legends, talked about like the weeks leading up to it. And a lot of it was, you need to wait until they rotate out to you, because we need them to get out of, not have all 6 players on the field directly in front of the hoops. And the only way to do that is to flip the field and then have them come out to you, then move the ball. A lot of the times that we did that, we were able to score pretty successfully. We were also able to set up our beaters for success. And we talk about this with our chasers all the time. If they're going to sit back in zone, you need to do your part in moving the ball, so that we can force the beaters to have to deviate their attention between the ball and the opposing beater, right? And it's simple stuff like that. I can say it 1,000,000,001 times, but until they see it happening consistently, they don't believe that it's going to work, right? And luckily enough, they believed, and everybody kind of figured it out as time went on. But that was our number one thing. Also implementing the usage of diamond. We use diamond formation directly up top, which is funny because it seems like we live in a time now where mark defense is making a return. because that was the only defense that people played when I first started playing quad ball. And now it's like 4 or 5 different versions of 2-2 zone plus trees and all that kind of stuff like that. But utilizing diamond to overload the top of any 2-2 zone that we go up against and putting too many defenders in one area for them to be able to defend, forcing them to over rotate and creating the opening on the backside. Simple stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm planning on writing an article because I think it's so interesting how long we were all in box against 2-2s and how everyone's shifting to diamond right now. When I was talking to some Europeans at Worlds Weekend, they were all shocked that Americans have been playing boxes against 2-2s. They're like, why isn't everybody in a diamond? So it's cool to see. But yeah, the last thing I'm going to ask you is now that your season's over and you can kind of put on that analyst hat with all the film you watch and all the sports you follow, what are your predictions for MLQ Championship?
It's been kind of wild to watch the development of, Washington always has been a pretty consistently good team. And honestly, the rise of the battle crabs has been pretty dope to watch throughout the course of throughout these last couple years. But it's going to be a lot of fun. Obviously, the front runner is the Austin Outlaws. Luckily, our mentality going in against them was like, guess what? There's only 6 of them on the field, just like there's only 6 of us. It's just about whether or not those 6 are better than our 6. And sometimes they were, and sometimes they weren't. I think between us and San Antonio, our game 2 versus Austin and San Antonio in game 2 and game 3 versus Austin, there's a lot to be learned from teams that have personnel that can match up that can potentially match up better. But just strategy wise, there were some struggles that we generated with the kind of players that we have who have half the experience of most of their roster. And then Austin obviously is going to come with every single thing, every single idea under the sun to be able to beat any opponent that they go up against, plus the fact that they're better athletes than like 90% of the people who are in the league, right? You guys were talking about San Antonio and concerned about the beater game. After being an assistant coach for Team Mexico this past World Cup, and of course playing against Chris multiple times, I think Chris is gonna do his thing. Also, Javi is heavily underrated on the San Antonio roster, right? Like he plays the same role in their defense when Chris is not in there. And then Bradley Himes, I think all those guys, Maya and Brandy, combined together, they're going to be more than enough for teams to be able to face off against. And teams that quote unquote have a better beater lineup than them are going to really struggle, because if you're even with San Antonio's beaters, you're still going to lose because their chasers are better than like 90% of the chasers. So obviously, I think Austin's going to be able to do some big damage. I'm interested to see how New York reacts after they've played a couple of competitive series, but I'm intrigued to see how they're going to react to the fact that Austin is still flying around and banging. Like, they hit pretty hard for a team that is that speed heavy, right? Guys like Austin Vallejo really don't pull punches when they hit you 90% of the time. And then for the dudes that don't hit, they're big enough to cover all 3 of the hoops at one time with JJ and Prada. I'm pumped to see what New York brings to the table. And then, of course, the Washington Admirals, I'm very excited to see, just because they have the length that kind of counteracts 80% of the teams in the league, that gives them a lot of problems. So yeah, nothing too crazy. I think I'm on the same page as everybody else. I can't wait to watch how these teams kind of clash together. Also, really excited to see what KC does. I feel like a lot of people, they have some club players that weren't available consistently throughout the summer, and so it gave some room for a lot of their younger players to develop. And I think when they have the roster combining all those guys together, it's going to be a problem for a lot of people. And obviously Chicago Prow, I think they're they got the cool new uniforms, and people are expecting them to win a lot of games. They got a lot of talent. Shout out to my dude Caleb Williams. He's been killing it all season after being on Legends for just one mere year. We taught him everything he knows. Don't forget that. I'm kidding. He's always been super talented. He didn't need our help at all.
Awesome. All right. Well, Ashton, thanks so much for taking the time tonight. It was a great season. It was fun to watch you guys. Hopefully we'll continue to see those improvements next year. You take care.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. And shout out to all the legends who were a big part of why the season was successful, including Joan, Ashton, Ashton Butler, not me. Ashton Butler, Nathan, all three combined to be our general managers for this season, and they killed it in our home series overall. Shout out to Wyatt. Shout out to all the practice squad players, Sean, John, and everybody else who made it possible for the legends to get to where we are. And of course, I'll see you guys at championships next year when we claim one of those spots.
Take care, Ashton.
No doubt.
All righty. So with that series out of the way, we're going to jump to our other series from the weekend, an East Division series that had some pretty, cataclysmic, I think, repercussions on kind of the trajectory of the league and kind of the history of the league. The Washington Admirals take down the Boston Forge 2-1 in 3 pretty competitive games. In fact, the least competitive one was the one that Boston actually won, a 135-50 win in Game 2. The other 2 games were 175-140 Washington, who had to come back from being down 30 at 20 minutes, and a 165-100 win in Game 3. That was basically, neck and neck. With the win, Washington finishes top 2 in the East Division for the second time ever and the first time since 2017. With the loss, Boston fails to finish top 2 in the East Division for the first time ever. And with most scenarios now pointing towards a Boston-Austin quarterfinal matchup at MLQ Championship, one of those 2 franchises, if that matchup does come to fruition, would fail to make a semifinal for the first time in MLQ history. A lot of parity and a lot of new teams, new faces kind of coming into the sport. And, it's exciting to see. But, we have a series to talk about, first of all, and it is this Washington and Boston series. I want to start with the highs. I want to start on the Washington side and kind of what this team, is accomplishing because, we've kind of talked about New York and Chicago and the way these teams have gotten very strategic in the ways they play. And this Washington team, to me, is just a machine that is just churning right now in the way they're playing. It's replaceable parts in the fact that all their players are just coming in and having effects. Nick, what are you seeing from this Washington team?
I'm seeing a team that understands its identity, right? They know they're not going to blow you away with their beating game. They know that they're going to have to make tough decisions in the ball movement game, but they have the players to do it. They have the players to play these aggressive style defenses. They have the seeker who wins, 2 out of every 3 50-50s at this point. They have a team that is willing to hit hard. They have some of the best point defense in the world on this team. This is a team that's going to keep playing all the way through every single game because up and down the roster, everyone understands that they can make an impact.
Yeah. Jack, what are you liking from this Washington team that you're seeing?
I'm liking the chemistry on offense. This is a team that's making a wager that they'll make some mistakes, but they're going to make fewer mistakes than you, and they're going to score more often than you. And so they're going to push the pace as fast as they can, and they're going to win because they've been playing together at this point. This Washington Admirals core knows each other now. They know each other's tendencies. They've integrated, those former Boston franchise players who moved down to the area at this point. They've added college players into the mix, several of whom have played several seasons, played practice squad, and it's just all coming together at the right moment late here in this season. It was not something that I necessarily expected from the Washington Admirals this season, but they've done it. They've finally knocked off Boston after trying for so many years to displace Boston or New York from one of those spots. This is just incredibly historically significant for the East Division in MLQ. Huge moment for Washington.
Yeah, and you talk about those players coming down from Boston and kind of their contributions, and that's kind of been like the backbone of the team the last couple of years, right? Where they've been so reliant. I think when we were talking to Keegan last week, and Keegan was talking about how, it almost felt that like down the stretch against the Outlaws, they didn't feel like they had the confidence to, go to, the whole depth chart because that their top lines have played so many minutes. But in this series, if you're talking as those Boston players as Tyler Trudeau, Brian Mulcahy, and Julia Bayer, they combined for 7 goals on the series. It's Shane McConaughey who basically came out of nowhere this season, who had 9 goals for Washington this weekend. It's David Littleton doing his best Justin Cole impression and being everywhere on the field, being constantly open. When New York tried to throw a triangle and one at Boston, Zach Doyle disappeared. When Boston tried to throw a triangle and one at Washington, David Littleton just broke it apart and was wide open for a pass, catch, and score. It's the fact that this team trusts every player. It's the same thing in the beater game, because I think this team at this point has a clear, number one pair. Like Bernie and Katrina, they both go +4 on the series. By far the most positive pair from anybody on the Washington side. And I think they're really systematic at this point. I think we can talk about that. But this is a team who's not going to rest on its laurels and, only rely on that pair. They're going to run through the rotations, make sure everyone's fresh so that they can keep running at the other team's beaters like absolute madmen and women and force all the dodgeballs on the ground. Like Keegan said, the strategy is get dodgeballs on the ground. And I think it wasn't always successful. I think game 2 is the game where it was least successful for the beaters, but it was successful just enough. Nick, I think we both really wanted to kind of highlight what Littleton did in this series. I kind of stole a lot of the thunder, but anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a player that you talked about doing all the things that Justin Cole did. He's doing things that are completely different in the same way, though. There's a lot of off-ball threat. Justin Cole was a huge aerial threat for this team, right? Justin Cole doesn't look like a player who you can put the ball up and he's guaranteed to come down with it, but he's guaranteed to come down with it, right? I think you put it best in that Littleton and Zach Doyle, if you were to put them in a blender, you'd come out with Justin Cole to a lot of extent in the off-ball side of things. But Littleton is just able to find these pockets of space, recognize. There's a play that stuck out in my mind where Taylor Crawford, I don't know why he ran away in the other direction, whether he was pushing for a fast break or whatever. But Littleton just runs a little tiny backdoor cut and catches the ball in stride, 2 hands, throws a little up fake, and just finishes easily on the backdoor cut. And that's not an easy thing for anyone to do, right? You don't see that happen, especially in this zone world. And the fact that he's making all of these moves into these little pockets of space, that we'll get to the Boston defense a little bit. And there were a lot of pockets of space, but it takes a special player to find those. And Littleton has definitely popped as a special player at this point.
And, Jack was really speaking to, kind of the comfortability, the familiarity within these players. And you were kind of highlighting, and I think I was a little bit as well. It's not necessarily that they have super fancily structured offensive and defenses, like complex plays, right? But there's clearly a million little ideas that are part of their system and part of the way this team is looking to play the game. I think one that I saw that I really liked was there was a play, I believe it was in game 1, where the Boston free beater gets cleared out of the play very, very early in the possession. Like before, I think the Quadball players even crossed half field. And on cue, as soon as the cross happened, and I think I even heard specific calls from the sideline as it was going, Katrina Hicks ran up full speed right at the engaged beater for Boston, just forced a double beat, clear them both out of the play, and then Bernie was right behind her to force the press, and then every Washington player was on their press marks to force the turnover. It was a completely designed play. It's not, it's not that this is our defense. This is what happens when this free beater's out of the play early. And it's just little things like that. It's the things we're seeing from the best teams in MLQ right now, from Chicago and from New York. And I think it's hard not to, at least talk about this Washington team in the same conversation as well. Switching over now to the Boston side of things, obviously, importantly, the return of Max Havlin for this team, I think, was something that was going to be talked about, no matter what. Plays with Serena Montero for most of the series, a little bit of Aaron McCready as well in flag runner on pitch. Obviously, Lewis Schuh's not back with the team yet. I think their hope is for her to be back for MLQ Championship. But I think the beaters on this team largely got the job done this weekend. In terms of average dodgeballs, yes, these Washington beaters at times have been able to get balls on the ground, but I don't think it was just that Max Havlin had a solid series. I think, Kieran Collier and, Leanne Dillman, players I think we were a little critical of in the New York series, kind of stepped up this weekend as well. but it's the offensive quadball side of the ball that's just coming up short right now. Nick, what are you seeing in that area of the game?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the opposite of Washington, right? The beater chaser synchronization on Washington was so sharp all weekend. And that's a little bit easier, right, when your strategy on offense is balls on the ground and it's just watch for the engage and then work off of that and say, like, our chasers are better than your chasers. But there were so many plays where the beaters either went ahead of the chasers and the chasers didn't react immediately off of it, and in the zone world you have to. There is no more time to set up the one-on-one. It is, you have to go as a team. It is all 6 players have to be working at the same time. Or the chasers would run down and force up a bad shot when the beaters weren't even in the picture yet, and so Washington got to press freely or pressure hard with their chasers. There's just, it seems like a lack of timing recognition for this Boston team, which relies so heavily on its beaters in the past. And it's really, really tough to see this team taking control into offense so many times and then just throwing away offensive possession after offensive possession, whether it's a true reset or an out-of-bounds play. It's just, there's a lot of really strange timing situations that just have been cropping up all year, but were really, really apparent this weekend against Washington.
Yeah, and then Jack, on the defensive side, there seem to be a lot of holes in the defense that we talked about Washington exposing. Obviously, this Washington team is a very good passing team. They're always going to have 4 people on the pitch who can throw a ball around. But what were you seeing in that aspect of the game?
Yeah, I think this Boston team has been very disappointing defensively. I think last year, and they have the personnel still this year to be a very physical team defensively, but the tackles just aren't being made. In terms of the beating game, I think they were drawn out a little too often. I think they maybe could have had a little bit more respect for how quickly Washington was moving the ball. And that's a hard thing to counter. Maybe it's a situation where offense is just better offense is going to beat better defense with how well Washington is playing offensively. But I think Boston had to recognize the chemistry that they were going up against and kind of pull back their beaters, redirect some of their focus towards the quad ball game. So yeah, I just saw them getting drawn out of position a little bit too much, away from the hoops. And I think a more conservative approach would have been a decent adjustment against the Admirals.
Are we sure this is a Boston team that wants to play zone? Because it seems like every time the ball moves, every player in the zone moves to a different spot, to whether it's to try and explode into a pseudo press or to sort of play mark defense, right? Like, this is just a team that it feels like it doesn't want to be playing these complex zones. And Ethan, I'm sure you can talk to this. Some of their more successful defensive possessions were in these sort of 3 trees hoop zone look. But it just feels like a team that wants to get out and wants to assert on the defensive end. And I think that by playing sort of these passive zones, you see a lot of these mistakes when players try to step out and assert what they're doing on the field.
Yeah, I think there's an identity crisis on this team, right? Because you really try to think about it, and this team, especially if we say that Louis Shu and Max Havlin are both ready to go by championship, this team is like not hugely personnel different than last year's team. There's a couple of key missings for sure, but there's a lot of similarities. So you're just kind of trying to figure out what's not working. And obviously we talked about the metagames a lot different, and the way these teams, their opponents are playing, is a lot more structured. And I think this team has identity issues. Nick, on one hand you say, hey, they want to be like an aggressive pressing mark team, but their beaters always want to make the play for control while playing defense instead of the play to make the defensive stop. So if you're going to be that aggressive mark, but then off of the first exchange of beats, your free beater goes for the play for control, that's just going to be no dodgeball. And as we talked about, these teams this team is really struggling to tackle right now. But then if you're going to sit back and play a 2-2, you have to have really well drilled rotations. And some of the things that for a 4th series of the season we were seeing out of the Boston rotations were really shocking to me. There was, ball moves to the right side and there's not a quick green headband rotation. So either Washington just backs the person down all the way to the hoops with their dodgeball, or they just clear out that person and it creates space there. Or ball goes to the right in a diamond. We're talking a lot about diamonds, and I think diamonds are going to be a big story at championship. We've seen it from Chicago. I think there's going to be a lot of them. Diamonds overload the top of a defense, and it was as simple as ball goes from the middle out to one wing, and the ball goes to the other wing where the cutter is, and Boston consistently didn't have answers for that. They weren't rotating that. Nobody was stepping off the hoops to try to fill those passing lanes. So, it's just kind of like, and, there's only, like we said, less than 20 days till championships. There's not a ton of time to fix all these issues. At some point, a team kind of is what it is. And I think the real final issue for identity-wise is they have a lot of personnel who's kind of, I feel like, strong on one side of the ball or strong on the other side of the ball. They don't have a ton of two-way players. And I think that's kind of created some interesting dynamics in terms of exactly how they want to, structure lines and play out lines, and maybe why teams are able to put them into more mismatches than, teams are sometimes able to, put other top teams. That said, I mean, we saw what this game can do, right? They took over for long periods of time. If anybody was worried that Max Havlin wasn't going to be back at 100%, Max Havlin made some ridiculous plays, forced a no bludger situation and got dodgeball control all without throwing a bludger on one play. That one was pretty crazy. So, there's definitely highs, but, there's definitely question marks as well. Jack, you tend to be our glass half full analyst. So talk me out of this with Boston a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I can give a glass half full take here, and it revolves around the prospect of Lulu Shu returning. I mean, if Lulu is back, Boston is the most dangerous team in the history of the play-in bracket. Boston is a play-in bracket team that can win a championship if Lulu returns. So yeah, I think it's that simple. I think there is still no beating pair that can match what Max Havlin and Lulu Shu can do. And I think last year the Boston Chasing Corps had the same personnel and had some of the same flaws, but they were they were disguised a little bit more. We didn't see them. I think they could cause a lot of noise if healthy.
Yeah, and I think like I said, at some point you are what you are. You can't rebuild your defense in the next 20 days. If I'm Boston, I am drilling for 20 days, no dodgeball situations, because this team is not converting on a lot of them, both in flag runner on pitch situations, which is the unacceptable one, obviously always. But when we talk about game one, which I think you could argue is the deciding, factor of their season, that game was theirs. Not only were they up, so they're up 30 at 28 minutes. There's only 2 quad ball possessions before the catch. Washington scores on theirs. Boston doesn't score on theirs. And then Washington catches. So now Washington is up 1. But Max Havlin and Serena Montero cook for like 4 or 5 possessions and constantly are getting stops into no dodgeball situations, or at least transition maybe against one kind of out of position dodgeball. And Boston just never scored. And that was basically the deciding point of their season. I think if they win that game, I think it's really hard for Washington to come back and find 2 wins in a row. As we saw, they didn't have the best game in game 2. So I think that's the number one thing, especially if you're hoping that Max Havlin and Lewis Shu are going to play some long minutes and kind of run all over the field. You got to make sure you're taking care of your transition goals, your no dodgeball situation goals, because that's kind of going to be really decisive. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, the best offenses came when this Boston team set screens, right? We watched Ian Skura try to take one-on-ones against Brian Mulcahy, who I think is if not the best, one of the best point defenders in the world. That's never going to work. That's not what you want, right? If you're going past Brian, then you're meeting a wall of a Tyler Trudeau, right, or a Shane McConaughey or Rachel Heald at hoops, and that's just not what you want. When Athena Mayer and Greg Bento were setting screens for this team and getting Ian Skura into space, that was when this team was working at its best. And those 2 players were setting some of the best screens we have seen since the years of like the Grace Dastu screening era for this Boston team. I mean, Riley Starr's should have gotten a couple of cards for throwing them to the ground, just trying to run straight through these screens, right? But they took it and got right back up and got back into play. I think that this team needs to sort of center around those players and how do we get players who can score for us into advantageous situations rather than forcing them to do it all themselves. And then I think this Boston team can sort of solve some of those offensive issues. Maybe not all of them, right? At some point, you got to be able to string 4 passes together. But if you can free up players for even a second of space, there are players on this Boston team that will burn other teams throughout this championships run.
All right. So, we should probably finish up soon, but I did want to circle back to something, we mentioned earlier in the show. And, next week, North Division Championships, Chicago will be playing Toronto for the North Division title and the privilege to choose whether you want to face the Washington Admirals on the Austin Outlaws side of the bracket or the San Antonio Soldados on the New York Titans side of the bracket. Jack, if you can either do it from, each team's perspective, or if you just have a general thought that you think all teams are kind of, what kind of side of the bracket would you be more interested in right
now? Yeah, I mean, I think, I want to see who Chicago plays. I think Chicago will have that kind of, whether it's San Antonio or Washington, that kind of marquee matchup of the quarterfinals. So, that's a really interesting choice. We've talked about it before. I think based on this weekend, if you're Chicago, you don't want to play Washington. I think Chicago's been playing fast all season, and Washington is maybe the one team that's shown that they can play fast just as efficiently and make just as few mistakes as Chicago. And so, I'd be worried about that. I think if you're Chicago, you have the beating advantage in both series. I think you have a slightly larger advantage against San Antonio. But the San Antonio Soldados team has caused a lot of headaches for the Chicago franchise, formerly Indianapolis Intensity. They've eliminated them twice, 2019 and 2021. So, I also would understand Chicago wanting to play a different team. So, I think it'll be a really interesting choice if the Prowl do indeed hold off the Raiders next weekend. The Raiders, I think would have, I'm just excited to see how they play this coming weekend, and then we can talk.
You're on mute, Ethan.
Sorry. Yeah, I think it's one of our more fun kind of interdivision rivalries that has happened over the last few years between the Chicago franchise and the San Antonio franchise. I think, that 2019 series, which kind of ended in, I think, like a 2-hour long intensity huddle after the games, just is kind of like etched into my head. And that was kind of a defining moment, I think, in that kind of program's trajectory. And now they're on the up and up again against a completely different kind of Soldados team if they do choose them. So I think it's fun. Nick, any disagreements with Jack there?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, right, this is a Chicago team on a mission, right? And the easiest way to start off that mission at championships is by going to go and play the San Antonio team. If you get this win, it's a massive victory for the program, right? It's going to be the first semifinals appearance for the program in a long time, as well as it's over the team that has knocked you out time and time again at this point, that has knocked you down. And I think that would be a big deal for this program. Plus, I think realistically at this point, right, you and I, Ethan, we're enamored with what they're doing on the offensive side of the ball. But I think defensively, they're going to come up with something, right, to try and take away Jay Stewart, whether it's a triangle in one or it's aggressive beating options at the top to force the pass away from somewhere else. I think that this San Antonio team, while it can hang with a good beating core to an extent, I think that I could see them struggling very hard against this Chicago deep beating core. We talk about 21 deep. This Chicago beating core just runs deep.
All right. And really quickly, Jack, since you were the one playing whatever the opposite, I guess, the devil's advocate is when me and Nick were voicing our concerns about Austin a few weeks ago. Here's the case I'm going to make, and then you can dispute it if you'd like. I think that if this Washington team does get by, let's say this Toronto team, if that's kind of the route things go, and matches up with Austin in a semifinal, I think there's some things that are pretty scary for Austin about that matchup. We just saw Washington absolutely tear apart a lazy rotating 2-2 zone. I've seen a very lazy rotating 2-2 zone from Austin. Does Austin have a giant beater advantage? That might be a big problem. Yes, but we were just talking San Antonio and Washington a lot of ways for the same team, and that San Antonio team found a way to hang. And obviously, this is a more veteran version of that team, probably a little bit more deeper version of that team as well. They're going to put a lot of pressure on players like we talked about. Maybe there's not as much depth in the female beating game this year for Austin. They're going to make Bailey Fields run for every minute she's on a pitch until she's tired. So do you disagree? Do you still feel really, really confident about Austin, that potential matchup? Or do you see some signs of life for Washington in a potential semifinal there?
No, that's an interesting point. I see some signs of life. I think Washington pushed Austin to 3 games last year in the quarterfinals. And I think this Washington team, presumably Rachel Heald will be healthy. She's been such a key part of what they've been doing. And they're just 3 lines deep this year, as head coach Keegan Remy Miller told us last week. They have 3 lines instead of 2 in the chaser game. Also in the beater game, they were really only running 2.5 beater lines last year at MLQ Championships. So they just have so many more options that they can turn to, I think. And the pace was something that Austin struggled with a little bit against San Antonio earlier this year. And so Washington really, taking that and making it their identity this year, embracing it in full, I think could pose some real problems for the Outlaws if they're not ready for it. I think they should be on high alert.
Awesome. All right. Well, with that in mind, this is going to do it for this edition of MLQ Replay. This weekend, all eyes will be on the North Division Championship, where 4 teams will contend for the 2 remaining bids, while Chicago and Toronto duke it out for the North Division Championship. We hope you tune in, and we also hope you consider supporting the Patreon. Cuts with Neves is churning right along, as well as the breakdown and talk about even more strategy than we are right now on this show. But we thank you, as always, for watching. For myself, for Nick, Jack, and Harry Clark, our producer, we hope you have a good night, and we'll see you in a few weeks at MLQ Championship in Des Moines.